Hello again, everybody. Welcome to your sample questions for the RNIP. So again, it's a pretty exciting time in immigration because it's always great when there's a new program, though I can completely understand for people getting ready for the ICCRC exam, well, it can be stressful. All right, so we're going to work through these three sample questions. They are, of course, in the new format for half of the exam, which is one scenario for three questions. Now, if you want more details on this, of course, be sure to join us for our seminar. If you feel like these questions are easy, perfect. If you feel it's a little bit tricky, well, I would very strongly recommend for you to work through all of the free lessons and, of course, work through simulation 1, 2, 3. Join us for the seminar, and you'll be really covered for anything tricky within those questions, because at that point, you'll have finished probably about 1,000 questions. So I would say be as prepared as possible. And you know what? You're taking a big step in that right now by working through all these videos. So let's jump into this question or these questions. All right, so I'll give you the scenario and the three questions here, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes. So this is about what you should expect in the exam in terms of time per question. So again, I'll stop talking here. I'll let you work through this. All right, so your time is up. I hope you answered the three of these. If you didn't, feel free to press pause and work through these. If you are using these videos with our materials, well, your test day data booklet would help you quite a bit. So you have, of course, the information needed to answer this question right at your fingertips in the test day data booklet. And if you don't, that's okay too. If you watch the previous lesson, you have an idea, of course, of the RNIP and those community requirements. All right, so let's work through the answers in the next few slides here. All right, so welcome back. If you pressed pause to work through the question, perfect. That's exactly what I'm hoping that you would do. If you are listening to this, I'll read the scenario out to you and the question, of course, and the potential answers. And hopefully something will click and you'll be able to get the answer really quickly. If it doesn't click so quickly, well, don't worry. We're going to go over everything in this video. Okay, so we have 3 towns in Manitoba. So 3 towns in Manitoba are interested in joining the Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot Program because they are facing a shortage of workers. One town, Jets Vilia, is 200 kilometers from Winnipeg and has a tourism-based economy. There is a huge need for workers, for employees to work in hotels and restaurants in the town because the population of 210,000 can't support the demand for workers locally. Half of the population lives in the downtown region where the most jobs are and where all of the immigrant support services are located. The mayor of Vilia has pledged his support to this program and has partnered with all of the necessary groups to meet the requirements of the program. Next, Icetown is also considering applying. This town is considered remote by Statistics Canada and has a population of 120,000 people. Another town 20 kilometers from Vilia is Ville, with a population of 1,000. Ville would like to recruit 5 to 10 foreign nationals to help fill labor shortages in their factories. So there's probably a lot of elements that jump out at you in this scenario. And that's the way that we designed the scenario, of course, is to try to lure you in a few different directions. And of course, to make things a bit complicated, because that's the way that, of course, the real exam is. That's the way that life is as an RCIC when you have a bunch of different clients and different options. All right, so let's take a look at the question. The question says, which of the 3 towns would qualify for the Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot Program? Then for the options, we have all 3 would qualify. For B, we have none of the 3 towns would qualify. For C, Ville and Icetown would both qualify. And D, only Icetown would qualify. So right away, when you look at these potential answers, you can see something that you should be pretty happy about. And that is that deciphering one town will be able to eliminate 2 answers. So we're pretty fortunate in this, and it's something to really notice in this, because what you're doing in the real exam, of course, is investing your time, investing your energy in certain sections of the scenario to find the important information. So what information is important in here so that we can answer this question? Well, let's take a look. All right, so I've got a little countdown timer here as well, just because we've already read through the scenario and we have an idea about these 3 towns. But again, if you have a piece of paper in front of you, just make a few little notes about each town here. This is what you're doing really, but in your head. But we can write it down because we're practicing, of course, for the real exam. All right, so if you've taken a few notes about each town, you probably noticed that Vilia has a lot of information and the other 2 towns just don't have that much information. So let's see how this plays a role, of course, in deciphering the correct answer. Okay, so these are the parts that are pretty important and that should jump out at you. You can see it's actually most of the scenario. And the important part in here, the important strategy that we're implementing, is to make sure that we can understand which parts of the scenario are important, of course, and which ones relate to each town, because that's what leads us towards the correct answer. So this is what should have jumped out at you for Vilia. So we have a lot of information in here. We have, of course, geography, population, the jobs, the community support, the mayor's support, everything like that. So there's a lot of information in there. And this might seem like a tempting choice. You might think that this town, or maybe we call it a city, yeah, but anyways, a town for the sake of this question, you might think that this qualifies. So we'll see if it does or if it doesn't. It certainly has a lot of elements that we probably know right away qualify this town, and maybe a couple that don't. We'll see. When we take a look at Icetown, it's pretty straightforward, right? We just have geography and population. And same thing here, right? So with Ville, we have geography, population, and their intent. So what they want to do, they want to bring in 5 to 10 foreign nationals. Okay, so what we need to do now, of course, is be selective with the information that we are using to get the correct answer. When you take a look at this, and I hope this sunk in for you while you were deciphering the scenario right at the beginning. Well, something that comes out in each town, something that's very obvious and very helpful for us to get the correct answer, is within the local community requirements. So remember, the local community has certain requirements that they have to meet in order to be able to join this program. Once they join this program, well, they can select foreign nationals. Now we're focusing on the community here with this series of questions. And within those community requirements, there's two really big elements that are very straightforward, really, in deciphering. And it'll be even more straightforward for you, really, after we work through these three questions. So within there, we have geography and population. Those are the most straightforward elements of the local community requirements. If a community does not meet those requirements, well, they don't qualify to join this program. All right, so with JETS Vilia, we have a lot of information given to us, but part of the job, part of the exam, part of the strategies we talk about over and over again is, of course, the importance of making sure that we can take out pieces of information that are important and leave information that is not important to us. Now, you may have noticed in these three towns, I just made up some cities, right? So JETS Vilia, Polarville, places like this. They're obviously not real cities. Maybe in the real exam, they'll give you real cities or real towns. You don't need to, of course, memorize where each town is in Canada and have a map with you and that kind of thing, right? Of course, the strategy is to look at this in the context of the questions that they give you. So first of all, when we take a look at the three cities, really, we can see that everything is in Manitoba. Now, remember that this program, of course, includes all of the provinces in Canada and all of the territories, except for, do you remember? Well, except for Quebec, except for the Maritimes. All right, so because these three towns are in Manitoba, we don't really need to worry about that element of geography. What we do need to worry about, of course, is where these towns are located and the amount of residents of these towns. They gave us a whole bunch of other information. So we have, of course, we need the support from the municipal authorities. We need the support from the local immigrant integration society, or whatever it's called. The economic community as well in these towns needs to support and really run the program. But all of these elements are, of course, important in the community meeting those requirements. But if the community doesn't meet these requirements, the geography and population requirements, those other ones don't even really matter in the context of this question. And the opposite would be similar as well, right? So if a local community met the population and geography requirements, but did not have, of course, those other elements, and there's a lot of them, as we saw in the previous lesson, well, they wouldn't qualify for the program either. Now, the reason we're talking about geography and population in here is because it's an element that goes through each town and gives us, of course, the information we need to make sure that we can answer this question correctly. So when we take a look at the geography here, well, we have JETS Vilia as being 200 kilometers from Winnipeg. Now, this doesn't give us too much information. And like I said, don't invest your time in memorizing the Canadian map and in memorizing, of course, all the little towns kind of all over Canada, right? In this case here, we have to work with the information that they give us. And in this case, they give us Winnipeg, and JETS Vilia is 200 kilometers from Winnipeg. Does that mean that JETS Vilia meets those geography requirements? Well, in the context of the question, we would consider it as yes. Maybe it's actually close to another city that has a lot of people in it. That has 100,000 people in it. But we just don't know. They don't give us that information. So we can't really let it play a role in choosing the answer here. All right, where this becomes very obvious though, so even though maybe we're not that clear with JETS Vilia geographically meeting those requirements, well, there's a pretty clear indicator that JETS Vilia does not meet the requirements of this program because of the population. So we can see that JETS Vilia has a population of 210,000, and as we can see highlighted in red over here, well, the town has to have a population of under 50,000 or under 200,000, and then those geography requirements come in. So with this information here, we know that JETS Vilia does not qualify. So even though we had a ton of information about JETS Vilia, the important piece of the puzzle, of course, was simply population. Okay, so with this, well, we can eliminate one of the answers but we need to carry on and carry on quickly, of course, because I don't know if you finished the 3 questions in the 2 minutes. If you did, perfect. I think a lot of you probably didn't because you're getting ready for the exam, you're studying and getting used to using all the material and everything like that. So we need to, of course, work through the remainder of this quickly. So what do we look at next? Are we going to look at Polarville or Icetown next? And this is part of the strategy that you need to think of, right? Is look at the remaining answers and see which one we need to take a look at. All right, so with this one here, we can see the population meets the requirements. The population is 1,000, and it's perfect. So when you take a look at the StatsCan index of remoteness, as we saw in the lesson, you might just take a quick look at it. You don't need to memorize those cities, those towns, of course, and see which ones qualify. But it's interesting to see that a lot of those towns have 1,000 people, 1,200 people, and they qualify in terms of geography, right? In terms of being considered remote, according to StatsCan. So Polarville meets these requirements. Now we need to take a look, of course, at the geography, the location of Polarville, and see if it meets those requirements now. So with this, we have a lot of information given to us. Now, Polarville is 20 kilometers from Vilia. Does this mean that Polarville qualifies? Because mathematically, Polarville would be 180 to 220 kilometers away from Winnipeg. And there's no mention of other larger cities around, with the exception, of course, of Vilia. All right, so what do you think? Now, if you see the tricky part of this scenario, it's here. It's right here. And if you got this, perfect. It shows that you are adept at, of course, looking through the scenarios to see some of the tricky elements. All right, well, Polarville is 20 kilometers away from Vilia, and Vilia has a population of more than 200,000. So when we take a look at this in terms of geography, well, we can see that there's no mention, of course, of being considered remote. So we wouldn't put that into our analysis. Instead, we can take a look at the information given to us here, which is pretty, I would say, pretty straightforward. Polarville would not qualify because in terms of geography, it is too close to a larger city. And that city is Vilia, as we saw before. All right, now we're left with 2 options here. If we had analyzed Icetown previously, well, it would have been a little bit complicated because we would be, I think a lot of people would reanalyze it to see if it's the answer, because we have to take a look at Polarville and see, of course, if Polarville would qualify. And we did this already, so now we're only left with Icetown. If Icetown qualifies, the answer is D. If Icetown does not qualify, well, the answer is B. All right, so let's take a look at Icetown. Now, Icetown is, of course, the final step in getting this answer correct. So in terms of population, well, we could see that we do meet one of those requirements. The first one would be eliminated, of course, when we look at population and geography. So remember, we have, of course, those 2 options. So the under 50,000 and 75 or more kilometers away from a major city, I guess we could call it, 100,000 people. Well, we don't qualify for that one, of course, because Icetown has exceeded the under 50,000 residents requirement. But Icetown is, of course, under 200,000 residents. So that's a good sign for us. Now, when we take a look at the other element that needs to be met, and this is one of many, of course, but in terms of the strategy we're using to get this correct answer, this is the other big one that we're really looking for. And that is being considered remote by Statistics Canada. Well, Icetown is considered remote. So that's some pretty good news given to us here. Now, if we take a look at, again, Polarville and our analysis of that, well, there's no mention, really, of Polarville being considered remote or not being considered remote, right? That information was just not given to us. But with Icetown, well, it's pretty clear that, of course, it is considered remote. So from this bit of information, and I say bit of information because there wasn't that much information given about Icetown and Polarville as well. There's a lot of information that they just didn't give us. Well, if you're curious, of course, about these questions over here, You can see the question really. They don't mention the other areas needed for selection. What do we do in these situations? It's a much larger conversation than we have time for in this video. But if you're going to join us for the seminar, we really talk about this thoroughly because it's very important to be able, of course, to look through these questions really, really quickly and be able to know how to answer these. All right, so the answer for number 1 then would be D. Would be Icetown is the only town that would qualify. Now we have to jump to number 2, of course. Why wouldn't Vilia qualify? And the beauty of this is that number 2 really gives us an option for number 1 in this case, right? Sometimes there's an answer in there that says Vilia does qualify, so it doesn't matter. And with that, we can't really use that then to make sure that our previous answer is correct. But let's analyze number 2, and again, move on to make sure that we get the correct answer here. Make sure that you got the correct answer here. All right, so with number 2 here, let's take a look at the options first, and then we will decipher whether or not we got the correct answer. Okay, so we'll take a look at A. So why wouldn't Vilia qualify? The town does not have adequate immigrant support services. Well, we could see that this isn't necessarily true. They give us a pretty strong indicator in here. So in the scenario, they say that Vilia has immigrant support services, mayor support, community support. They talk about the mayor. They say the mayor is partnered with all the necessary groups to meet the requirements of this program. All right, so that is, of course, very important for this. Does this mean the mayor has partnered with all the groups to automatically be selected for this program? No, as we saw, the population exceeds the minimum requirements. Okay, and that gives us, of course, B as the answer. The town exceeds the minimum population requirements. There's no partnership that a mayor can do to make sure that 10,000 people leave the town, right? So again, it leads us towards confirming our answer that Vilia does not qualify for this. But of course, we need to take a look at the other answers, right? The town does not have an economic development organization. Again, we're given a pretty strong indicator that there is, because the mayor has, of course, partnered with all the groups needed for this, which would obviously include an economic development organization. And the town is too close to a large city. That's a tough one as well, right? So it's a bit vague. And the town is actually a large city because it has 210,000 people, but there's no indication that there is, of course, a big city next to it that would disqualify Vilia from this program. For that reason, of course, we saw that the population is the reason why Vilia is not selected or would not be selected for this program. Okay, finally, we're left with number 3 here. Based on the information provided, what would help Ville make a stronger application? And again, because we've analyzed this so thoroughly, well, we probably have an idea already of the answer. But again, let's look at why the answer you chose is correct or incorrect. All right, so let's look at Ville here. So we saw that Ville has a population of 1,000, which is great. So in terms of the population requirements of the local community requirements, well, Ville is doing really well. However, the difficulty, as we saw, is in terms of geography. So Ville is just too close to a large city. All right, so we saw this one already. And I think this is a tricky little element in the scenario, is that a lot of people would focus on Winnipeg. So they would just focus on Winnipeg, but not the fact that they give us information that Vilia is too close to Ville for Ville to be accepted. And the other element is you might be tricked by thinking that if Vilia doesn't qualify, well, Ville might qualify. Or you might think that the fact that Vilia doesn't qualify for this program might affect the application of Ville. And the answer to that would be no. When we look at, of course, all the information released by the government with regard to this program, you could theoretically, I guess you could have 2 towns right next to each other who both qualify for the program. So one qualifying for the program would not affect the other. However, in this case, of course, the fact that Vilia has such a large population affects Ville because Ville is so close to Vilia. All right, so with this one here, there's no mention of Ville being considered remote either. So if Ville were remote, from the information given to us, we're considered remote, that means that they would qualify for this program. All right, so we know that Polarville does not qualify simply because they're so close next to a large city. And with this, when we look at the answers, the other answers, does having a French-speaking population help Polarville? No, meeting the requirements means, of course, meeting the requirements. The only thing that would help them is if Vilia had not had such a large population. So even if Vilia were, let's say, further away, well, maybe that would make a difference in here. But the fact that Vilia is so close gives us such a clear indicator that Polarville can't really do anything. They're too close to a large town, or large, I would call it a city even at that point, right? Okay, and then in terms of C and D, having effective economic service for newcomers or having a strong economic development plan, well, those would help, of course, except for the fact that geographically, Polarville just doesn't qualify for this program. Okay, so that concludes the answers here. If you got all three of these answers correct, good for you. That's perfect. Obviously, you've been studying, you've gone through the lessons, you've gone through your test day data booklet because this information is in there as well. You understand how to use it. If you didn't get these answers correct, that's fine. We're going to keep working together all the way up to the exam to make sure that, of course, you can be successful in the real exam. All right, so the answers, as we saw, were for number 1 was D, only Icetown would qualify. For number 2, well, Vilia, as we saw, exceeded the minimum population requirement. And that was really the key to answering all three, was understanding why Vilia doesn't qualify. And when we take a look at number 3, well, we see the link between Polarville and Vilia, which, of course, gives us all the information we need for Polarville and the information we need to answer this question quickly. So again, if you got these answers correct, perfect, good for you. Keep moving forward. This is something you can obviously check off the list. And if you didn't get this correct, that's fine. Work through the set. We have questions with the RNIP, of course, in the simulations. And it's going to get easier and easier as you keep working through all the steps towards the exam. All right, so if you've worked through the previous lesson and you've gone through this one, congratulations. You're, again, a step closer to passing the ICCRC exam. If you feel like you want to work on this a little bit more, perfect. I mean, there's questions in the simulations on the RNIP. And again, I would say to invest, you've invested about an hour in the previous lesson, so the lesson that we did, and this one. So if that's enough for you, perfect. If you want to work more, that's fine as well. Remember, of course, you have a lot more stuff to work on. So if you got these ones correct, that's fantastic. And you can move on to the next subject. If you didn't get these answers correct, that's fine. You probably understand why you didn't get the answers correct. And that's the whole learning process. All right, everybody. So a big thank you again for tuning in and joining us. Good luck to you in preparing for the exam. And of course, stay tuned. I mean, we have more and more lessons all the time. And we look forward to helping you become RCICs and helping you even beyond that, right? Helping you become better RCICs. Okay, so thanks again. Have a great day.